300s we have the head being smaller, a longer, more slender aesthetic body. And so I just wanted you to notice this about the classical period, that the emphasis on what is ideally beautiful is really different to what it is later. So Sachi's already spoken to you about some of these areas that you need to be looking at in Section 8 responses. So I just thought you may be comparing two works. I think that's quite common in the, and I've got some suggested pairings at the end of this presentation. So you'll be given one or more of your prescribed works, followed by 3 questions, as you know. So these are the areas that I'll be kind of covering today. Techniques, and thinking about techniques as being 2 different kinds of techniques. So for example, the actual depiction of artistic techniques, and then the techniques used to create the works, such as bronze casting, ideas, how the works reflect socio-historical context, how the works are typical of their artistic period, the content of the works. So like the Nyabid, for example, has a story behind it. You need to know those stories. They might be asked in, for example, the 4-mark question. And some of the works have a specific context, such as how they were found, like the Riachi Bronze Warrior A. So I'm going to be talking just briefly about some of the things you can talk about from socio-historical context, which will allow you to think about how the appearance of the statue reflects what's going on in the world that created it. So obviously we can say a lot about the archaic period. It's a very long period, it's a very varied period, but for our purposes we focus on a fear of chaos and a need to create order. So the things that you've been learning about in the classical period about humanism, human confidence and control, that didn't exist in the archaic period to the same extent. And so the idea of creating control and order in the art is a way of reflecting and thinking about what that period is like. And this period was very derivative, influenced by Egyptian art, and it wasn't really until about 490 that Greek art became really individualized and different to the works that were created around it in the ancient world. So you don't have any early archaic sculptures in your selection, but I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things about them. They have an oriental influence, blank expressions, and we know about the archaic smile, which comes in a little bit after this. They're compact and solid, and they have stylized depictions of the body. And then our works that are set for this year are from the middle archaic and late archaic. So obviously there's a development through that period. We have the archaic smile coming in, but the main development is that the stances become less rigid and the depictions of the body become, and we're mainly focusing on the male body here because the women are clothed and the men are naked, of course, as you can imagine. So we're interested in the way that also the techniques become more advanced. They become more experimental with poses so that they're not so rigid and scared of the sculptures themselves being broken. So let's have a look at our first sculpture, the calf bearer. And we see that he has his little archaic smile, and he's quite generic in his expression. So I've just got some details about his context. So he's an offering to Athena. I'm sure you know all of this stuff. I'm sorry if I'm repeating some of the things you've had in class, but I'll just move through it quite quickly. And I think an interesting thing about this sculpture is it shows how the sculptors in this period were quite scared about sculpting the heads of sculptures. So they were scared that the necks were too vulnerable and that they might break. And so there's a lot of things they did to make the necks more solid. often it was quite elaborate hair that made the whole area thicker so that it was less likely to break. Here we have an actual path protecting the head, and we can see that it has quite a symmetrical appearance. And in terms of the ideas that we're interested in, I just put an idea thing on every slide. So here we're interested in the connection between man and animal and reverence for the gods. So this is an offering to a god, and that context is of course important. All right, moving on to our next sculpture. I personally find this sculpture a little bit disturbing. This is the Rampant Rider. So there's a whole genre of Greek sculptures that are just about sporting victories, and obviously that shows the importance that sport has in Greek culture, and also the idea of the beautiful and perfect male athlete and the depiction of the male body through an athlete. So in this case, this is a piece where his hair is now shorter. We notice his smile is still archaic. He's still quite a generic person. He's not an individualized person. He's an athlete, and yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement in the sculpture. And we can compare him to the sort of physical movement we get later on in the classical works. But he is representing glorious sporting victory and being an idealist athlete. So I think if you're writing about these sculptures and comparing the depictions of the male sculptures, one of the things you can compare is how detailed the musculature is. And so you can see here that the muscles are not very detailed in their depiction, but there is some attempt at depicting them. All right, let's see what women in the archaic period look like. They wore clothes, so they were modestly dressed, and we'll see later on in the later classical period that women began to be depicted naked in certain circumstances, mainly when they were mythological figures and they were part of a story. But this is a Kore, standing female figure. And she has her archaic smile, but you can see that it's a little bit less aggressive in its smiling, and it's more gentle and welcoming. In fact, she's, I think, very beautiful, and you can see that she was once painted. It's very hard for us to accept that these beautiful white marble objects were once very garishly painted, but we know that they were. We're still protecting the neck with the hair, and that was a thing that is pretty consistent through most of the archaic period. So she's obviously, I think, holding something, probably an apple, and she's lost her arm, unfortunately. So female modesty, we would talk about an idealised female beauty. Okay, let's move on to our next sculpture, which is the marble funerary kouros. So we do have another funerary work, which I think might be a good comparison to prepare for with that later work, which we'll talk about at the end. So you can see that the depiction of men has really changed by this time, just towards the end of the archaic period, 510 to 500. You can see that the body is much more elongated and graceful. You can see that it's much less static and block-like. You can see that the musculature is more detailed, although still not entirely accurate. And we mainly look around, sort of around the hips. The way that they're sort of curved in this period is not quite how they appear later, and we'll talk about that on a later slide. And his hair's not as long. They've suddenly got some confidence in depicting the neck as it appears potentially in life. He's still standing in this 1 foot forward stance, which is based on Egyptian standing figures at this period. In an earlier period that this is influenced by. So he's more energetic than the earlier mid-archaic and early archaic statues. And he's a traditional kouros, and so you can talk about him, and you may be given a statue like this to compare to one of the high classical male statues. All right. So I'm sure you've learnt in class about the Persian wars and the victory of the Greeks, which gave them great confidence, and some would argue the confidence to produce the amazing original works that they produced in the 5th century BC. And so I think being familiar with that, it's something that you will generally mention. It might be a question in the 4-point or the 6-point question about the socio-historic period and how it influences art. And I think the words confidence and uneasiness are good words to describe the early classical period. The high classical period gets a little bit overconfident. It loses the uneasiness. And so that confidence combined with uneasiness, we're looking for things in statues like a knowingness, a sort of alive, looking at the world in a certain way, but also being a little bit severe. And severe is often a word that is used to describe the sculpture from this period, the expression on the faces of the figures, because they're thinking about the world, but they're a little bit worried about their place in the world. And we know that their concerns were correct, that being too arrogant and too confident did not turn out well for the Athens of the 5th century and their loss in the Peloponnesian War later on in that century. So we have basically the move from archaic sculpture to classical sculpture is all about movement. And the first movement that happens is from standing like this instead of standing like this. Suddenly they just relax one of their hips and bend a knee. And just that movement is the birth of originality and the genius of the sculpture in the classical period. And obviously it goes on from there and lots of things develop from that. And that position, that kind of S-shaped position, is called contrapposto, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go along. So drapery becomes more natural, but the main thing that you can talk about, I think, in the early Greek sculptures that we have is the amazing explosion of new and dynamic poses, like the Poseidon, the Dyskolos, which we'll be talking about. And representation of action and feeling as opposed to the generic appearance of the archaic sculptures. Alright, striving for archaic perfection is obviously something that happens through all Greek art and architecture. Alright, let's look at our first early classical sculpture. So it's such a huge change, isn't it? And we haven't got on our collection some of the transition pieces that show you how we went from those archaic works to these works. This is obviously an original bronze. Most of the sculptures that you have been looking at are, as you will know, Roman copies of original bronzes in most cases. Sometimes they were marble. And therefore it is a very special work because there are not very many surviving original bronzes. So people argue a lot about whether this is Poseidon or Zeus. I think a lot of textbooks suggest that it's Zeus. I've worked with people who are convinced that it is Poseidon. So it depends whether you think that Zeus stabs people with his lightning or throws it up like that. I think it's Poseidon personally, and because of the angle that you might hold a trident at instead of lightning. All right. So he's got this amazing energy, and you can see his lifted back foot as if he's about to throw. It's something that we would never have seen in the archaic period, and just the amazing appearance of his face as well, the confidence, the godlike serenity that he has. And most of the sculptures of this period, they don't always have those sort of elaborate beards. Some of them do, but that's a particular iconography for the gods, and so that is there for him because he is either Zeus or Poseidon, who can say. So his idealized male form, warrior strength, and that was what we were talking about earlier, that the 5th century BC is all about the idealized form as having a purpose, the purpose of being a fighter, a warrior, an athlete, whereas later on in Greek art it became about more just beauty for its own sake. And thinking about the sophistication of the musculature here that we see comparing to what we saw in the archaic period, and the accuracy of the depiction of the male form. Okay, so this is a piece where you need to know a little bit of background. I'm sure you do know this, but make sure you just know the details for, and maybe the names for the exam. So the Lapiths versus the Centaurs. The main thing here is that this is about a little bit of post-war propaganda from Greek sculpture about we won the war because we're more civilized. That's who we are. But we're not going to say it directly. We're going to say it through an allegory of the battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs. So we're going to use mythology, but everyone knows really that we are the Lapiths and the Persians are the Centaurs, right? Because they're quite barbaric and not as good as us in any way. So this is from the temple at Olympia, and obviously we have a later masterpiece from the Parthenon, which also depict this theme. So it's possible you could get a comparison based on this content. So this is a place where the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, just make sure you know the context of that. It's a place where the Olympic Games happen. It's a place where athletes make offerings. And so you could see this contest as being like a sort of almost like an athletic contest, but really it's not. It's there to have like other purposes as well. So it is about contest, but really it's primarily about civilization and the victory over the Persians. But here we have also, it's a fight, and yet it is not very dynamic, is it? She doesn't look like she's really moving. She looks like she's just thinking a little bit about the fight rather than taking part in the fight. Her drapery is quite static, and she has that real severe style, early classical expression. And let's move on to our second Temple of Zeus at Olympia piece. So this is the West Pediment Apollo. He's umpiring the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs, and he represents law and civilization. It's really the same ideas that we saw in the rest of the West Pediment ideas: authority of the gods, law and civilization, context. So it's really interesting in the classical period that sculptors were very proud of how they did drapery. And so even if drapery isn't always needed, they'll just put it in randomly. Sometimes it's just on like a little tree trunk by the side, just some drapery, just to show I can do my drapery, just need to get that done. So we can see that a little bit there with the depiction of Apollo. Okay, and Riachi Warrior A. So Warrior B is not on the course. He's not quite as exciting. His head's a little bit more squashed by his helmet that's missing. So they've chosen the prettier warrior for you guys. So he's exciting because he and his friend Warrior B were found in 1972 in a shipwreck. And so that context is really interesting. And as I said, there aren't many surviving Greek bronzes. So it's quite an exciting find and object to have. So this is a great depiction of the idealized male warrior body. Relaxed stance. So this picture is obviously from the back and the front, but looking at where we're looking at the front of the warrior, the relaxed stance of him and the way in which he has one knee bent, he's got contrapposto, the kind of the hip a little bit. He's got a very serene, calm expression. He has very detailed hair and beard, and he has amazingly detailed and amazing attempts to create authentic musculature for his body. He originally had glass eyes, copper lips, and silver teeth. Exciting times for him. So he is there to represent the ideal male form, humanistic confidence, and warrior culture. That is some ideas if you want to bring up, write about the context and ideas in your section A analysis. All right, Discobolos. So the Discobolos is an amazing piece because it represents an idea called rhythmos. And rhythmos was the concept of depicting a movement by having different aspects of the movement depicted. So if you actually look at that and really think about how a man would throw discus, he would not have his back leg in that position. That would not be part of him getting ready to throw discus. So Myron didn't make a mistake when he did that. He was trying to depict different stages of the movement, which was a sort of artistic attempt that people were really interested in the early classical period. And so we're interested here again, idealised male form, glory of sporting victory. So again, within the form of sporting sculptures. Okay, quickly moving on to high classical art. So, as you will know from your context work, the Athenians decided to use the money from the Delian League to beautify their own city, and they started oppressing members of the Delian League, creating a sort of Athenian empire that became an actual empire. And so this was a time of almost overstepping and being overly confident, and the serene period and the uneasiness is a little bit lost. The uneasiness is lost and replaced with the serene sort of confidence of the classical period. Okay, and we have important people like Pericles, Phidias, and the idea of an Olympian feeling, the feeling that but almost like humans have the confidence of the gods. That was almost part of the arrogance of the high classical period, which we also see in the Parthenon frieze and other aspects of the Parthenon. Okay, this is the Diadomenos who's tying his victory wreath or fillet around his head. And we can see the idealised male form. We can see that it's really important to depict drapery. Just put it on a random tree trunk if you must. It's got to be there. If you want, because you want your male form to be entirely naked, like not having the drapery in the way, but you still need the drapery to show how brave you are. But this is a Roman copy, so the bronze may not have had that little drapery section. This is a really great piece to look at the sort of contrapposto style, the relaxed, the knee forward, the hips slanted, and the beautiful face of the Diadomenos. I'd encourage you, I haven't got a picture here, I'd encourage you to look at some of the other pictures of him from underneath, where you can see the really serene, beautiful expression on his face. Alright, the Niobe. So she's allowed to be naked because increasingly women were depicted naked, particularly in the 300s BC. But in this context, she's a mythological figure and a slightly different kind of status. She's wounded. I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but make sure you know the story. She's a child of Niobe whose children were killed because she was too arrogant in comparing herself and saying she was better than the mother of Apollo and Artemis, Leto. So make sure you just have all those details there. There could be a question, a 4-point question, for example. So she's all about idealized female form, the power of the gods, and the results of hubris. And we can see that, she is pretty naked, but should we put some drapery in? Yeah, we should. We should put it in. And there's a lot of energy to the pose, much more energy than we've had in other sections in earlier periods. And we've got some emotion here, like the pain of the dying Niobe, who is shot by an arrow in the back. So she's trying to take the arrow out of her back, essentially, which we know from first aid is not advisable. Right? More lapis, more centaurs. We're back now to the Parthenon. So again, the same ideas that we had in the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, but here we have a much more sophisticated depiction of this fight, and it's much more alive with movement and thoughtful with composition. The metopes are you should look up where they are, they're up high, and I don't have a diagram of them for you, but they are visible from the outside in the way that the frieze was not. It was harder to see. And so they're quite large, but they would have looked quite small when seen from beneath the temple on the Parthenon on the Acropolis. So here we have, look at the symmetry of this depiction. Some of the metopes are really impressive and some of them are less so. So they were done by different artists. This is one of the better ones. We can feel the real energy, the pain, the bunching of the muscles of the centaur, showing his movement, and just the sort of the action of the lapith there as well, sort of almost quite balletic. All right, and same ideas, civilization, barbarism. Okay, jumping on to late classical art. I think in your course it's just called classical art. I just wanted to make a quick distinction that there was a change of mood in Athens, obviously, when the Peloponnesian War started. Things started to go really badly during that war, and art did change. I should just say also on this slide that I would recommend the book Pollitt's Art and Experience in Ancient Greece if you want to read more about the connection between socio-historic context and the works. He does that in a really detailed and excellent way. So he coined a phrase which was refuge in gesture. The idea that, okay, things are going really badly for us in the war, Pericles died of the plague, that was really horrible. We don't want to make things about ideas and confidence anymore. We want to make things that are beautiful to cheer us up. And so the last few sculptures that I'll just quickly look at, we have, this is the Caryatid from the Erechtheion, which is on the Acropolis. It's part of the approach to the Parthenon, so people would have walked past this sculpture on the way to make dedications and offerings at the Parthenon. And a Caryatid just means a column made of a woman, because, you know, that's just what women have always So I think if you're writing about this period, one of the key things is to talk about the wet look drapery. So this is where they went, okay, we're really good at drapery, we really love that. We're also really good at depicting the female and male forms now. Why not have both? Like, could we have see-through drapery now, please? Can we have the wet look? And so this is what they did. And you can see her leg through her clothing. I suspect this could be a good comparison to the peplos chlorae from the Archaic period, in the way that the clothing is depicted, the leg is seen through the clothing, and there's just an elegance and control to this image. And the last piece, because I'm running out of time, is the Grace Stele here. So I'm sure you'll know that in Grace Steles in ancient Greece, the dead figure was seated and the alive figure was standing. So this is a depiction of a mistress and her servant girl. She's sitting, and we know her name because it is on there. And these depictions, this grave stele is an example of how we learn a little bit about ancient Greek life, what it might have been like. So we see here that the maidservant is handing her a jewellery box, and she's holding a piece of jewellery that was painted on that's gone. And she is depicted with wet look drapery of the period. You can see her legs through her clothing, but you can also say, oh yes, the person was very good at doing her drapery. So the focus on elegance and beauty in this period, respect for the dead, depiction of women in domestic settings, and a source of knowledge of domestic settings comes from a number of depictions like this. So just 1 minute before I finish. These are my suggestions for comparisons that might come up in the exam. So Pethos Chore and Caryatid, talking about the different way that clothing is depicted, all the things that have developed, the expression on the face, the hair, all of those things. An archaic depiction of an athlete, very static, very still, versus the incredible flowing Discobolos. The lapis and the centaurs from different periods, from early classical versus high classical, the different energy of those two pieces. And finally, I'd suggest that the two funerary pieces might be a point of comparison in their depiction of how the dead were honoured in different periods. Thank you very much. Are there any quick questions?
Miss Mulready, I always thought that the whole beauty standard, Celtic beauty standard thing was a modern phenomenon. Is it at all possible that the Greeks also found insecure when they had the paint definition and so on?